Last week in chapter 19 we saw the destruction of the city of Sodom and the rescue of Lot from the city there, and at the end of the chapter we saw the origin of the Moabite and the Ammonite people through whom Lot's daughters were those nations came through Lot's daughters and the relationship that Lot had with his daughters. So we move on to chapter 20 this evening. We have an incident here in this chapter similar to one that we had earlier in the book as well. This concerns Abraham and Abimelech here. So I'm going to read chapter 20 verses 1 to 7 to begin with. From there Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, "Lord, wilt thou slay an innocent people? Did he not himself say, 'She is my sister'?" And she herself said, "He is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now then restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all that are yours." Abraham now left Hebron or Mamre, where we had last seen him in chapter 18, verse 1. The Lord had appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre. That was back there in chapter 18, verse 1. And from there he journeyed to the south, or southwest, into the territory of the Negeb. And you can see on the map there the location of Mamre and Hebron, and then to the southwest there is Gerar, where he ends up, and the Negev is that desert area to the south there. So this is where Abraham is moving on to, and he first dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and then he came to settle in this place called Gerar, which was in the land of the Philistines. The Philistines occupied this land, as we learn from chapter 21, verse 32, where we meet this Abimelech again, and it refers to Abimelech and his army returning to the land of the Philistines. So that's the region along there was the land that was occupied by the Philistines. We're perhaps more familiar with the Philistines from the time of David, but they are present at this time as well. The king of Gerar is this man named Abimelech, and his name Abimelech means Melech is father, or my father is king. The Hebrew word Melech is the word for king, and Ab is the word for father. So Abimelech means Melech is father, or my father is king. When Abraham arrived in Gerar, then he introduced Sarah as his sister, as he had done when he went to Egypt, as we saw back in chapter 12, verses 11 to 13, when there's a famine in the land and Abraham and Sarai go down to Egypt. And verse 11 says, "When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, 'I know that you are a woman beautiful to behold, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account.'" So this is something that we've seen Abraham do before there in Egypt. And in Egypt, Abraham had said Sarah was his sister because he feared for his life. And he repeats the scheme here in Gerar because he is again fearful for his own safety. Abimelech must have heard reports of Sarah's beauty, and so he sent for her and took her into his harem, intending to make her his wife. Abraham would have been regarded as a powerful man, and an alliance with him sealed by marriage to apparently his sister would have been an attractive prospect for Abimelech. However, by means of a special revelation, God intervened and came to Abimelech in a dream at night and warned him that he was a dead man because he had taken a married woman into his harem. Verse 4 tells us here that Abimelech had not approached Sarah. Abimelech protests his innocence to God, asking, "Lord, wilt thou slay an innocent people?" Similar to the question that Abraham had asked God when God had indicated he was going to destroy the city of Sodom. Will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? Abraham had asked. And Abimelech is asking a similar question, Lord, will you slay an innocent people? And the word innocent here is a word that means righteous. And in his defense, he goes on to say that Abraham had said to him, "She is my sister." And Sarah had said, "He is my brother." And Abimelech says in verse 5, "In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this." And Abimelech had not touched Sarah. He had acted with integrity, believing that Abraham and Sarah were. So would a just God then destroy an innocent or a righteous people because of Abimelech's ignorance? Well, God responds to Abimelech by telling him that he knows he had acted with integrity, and it was God actually who had kept him from sinning. He says, "Therefore I did not let you touch her." So somehow God had restrained Abimelech in that. God restraining his actions so that he would not sin against him. Abimelech's sin would not only have been against him, but also against God as well. God now tells Abimelech that he is to restore Sarah to Abraham. God says that Abraham is a prophet and he will pray for Abimelech to live. This, interestingly, is the first use of the word prophet in the Bible. And the prophet is one who speaks on behalf of another, and the prophet is God's spokesman. So Abraham would be acting as God's spokesman. So if Abimelech fails to restore Sarah to Abraham, then God warns him that he will destroy both Abimelech and those who belong to him. Well, reading on with the story here from verse 8 to verse 18 to the end of the chapter, we read on, "So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things, and the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, 'What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done.' And Abimelech said to Abraham, 'What were you thinking of, that you did this thing?' Abraham said, 'I did it because I thought, there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham and restored Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, 'Behold, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you.' To Sarah he said, 'Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is your vindication in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are righted.' Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife." So early in the morning, after Abimelech has had this dream, this message from God, Abimelech summoned his servants and he told them of the situation. And when they heard of this, they were very much afraid. So the problem needed to be resolved quickly. Abimelech summoned Abraham in order to confront him and to rebuke him about his behavior. He asks him a series of questions here. Why has he done this? What sin have they committed against Abraham that he has brought this great sin upon the kingdom? Abraham has done things he should not have done. So what was he thinking that he did this thing? So Abimelech's questions here would have shown to Abraham that he was fully aware of what had happened, and he was now giving Abraham the opportunity to explain himself and to make any charges against Abimelech if he felt that he had been wronged in any way. As happened in Egypt, Abraham's sin of lying or telling this half-truth has been exposed. Abraham seeks to justify his behavior by saying that he had acted out of fear, as he had done in Egypt as well. In verse 11 here, he says, "I thought, there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." On this point, Abraham seems to have misjudged Abimelech badly. Abimelech apparently seems to have had respect for God and was certainly willing to listen to God. It's interesting to notice that people outside of Abraham's own family were worshipping God or were aware of God and listening out for God. Abraham also claims that, well, technically he had not lied because Sarah really is his sister, and he explains that she is his half-sister who became his wife. So they have the same father but different mothers. Abraham then had been economical with the truth. He also refers here to the agreement that they had made when God had first called him to leave his home, that at every place they came to, Sarah was to say, "He is my brother." But this agreement that they had made shows perhaps how apprehensive Abraham must have been for their safety during their travels, and that perhaps he was not really fully trusting in God for their protection, that he felt that he needed to do this. But as well as restoring Sarah to Abraham, Abimelech also gave Abraham sheep and oxen, male and female slaves, and he invited him to dwell wherever he pleased in the land. The land is open to you, just go and dwell wherever you want to. The gifts offered here indicate that Abimelech recognizes that he had acted hastily in taking Sarah into his harem before establishing her true identity. Abimelech also tells Sarah that he had given Abraham, and interestingly here he refers to Abraham as your brother, 1,000 pieces of silver, and he says to her, "It is your vindication in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are righted." So this money, this 1,000 pieces of silver, a substantial amount of money, is a sort of form of compensation or damages in order to prove that Sarah's character remains unblemished by this incident. So honor was being restored for everyone here, to Abraham, to Sarah, and to Abimelech. Well, after these things had been done in order to put matters right, then Abraham prayed for Abimelech and his household as God had told him to do so. And in response to Abraham's prayer of intercession, God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves, because we are told that God had closed their wombs so that they could not bear children. And it's only at the end of the story here that we learn that God had done this, that God had inflicted Abimelech's household with infertility because of Sarah, and somehow Abimelech himself was affected, that he too is healed as well. So that condition is now lifted by Abraham's prayer. Abraham's intervention in prayer restored that and lifted that. So God's intervention in this situation then ensured that Sarah continued, or that she remained as Abraham's wife, and the promise of a son for Abraham and Sarah was intact, that promise would still be fulfilled. Because if this situation had been allowed to develop without God intervening, then that would have put that promise of a son for Abraham and Sarah into jeopardy. But God was ensuring that that promise of that son would indeed be fulfilled. We come into chapter 21 and we see the fulfillment of that promise. So chapter 21 concerns then the birth of Isaac in verses 1 to 7. So we'll read here chapter 21, verses 1 to 7. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would suckle children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So after waiting for 25 years, the promise that God had made to Abraham, he and Sarah would have a son, is now fulfilled. So verse 1 here says, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. So God kept the word that he had spoken to Abraham. Back in chapter 17, verses 15 to 17, where God had said that it would be Sarah who would have the son. Chapter 17, verse 15, God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will be a mother of nations. And then God made that same promise to Sarah herself in chapter 18, verse 10. The Lord said, I will surely return to you in the spring, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. So now Sarah conceived, and she gave birth to a son at the time God had said. Back in chapter 17, verse 21, where God said, but I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year. That it was Sarah who conceived and gave birth identifies the child as the one promised by God. And as always, God is true to his word. God keeps his promises. Abraham named his son Isaac, a name which means laughter, again just as God had said the child would be named in chapter 17 and verse 19. After Abraham had laughed, God says, Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. So Abraham is completing God's instruction there in naming him Isaac. So in obedience then to the command of God and in accordance with the terms of the covenant that were given in chapter 17, verses 11 to 12, Abraham then circumcised Isaac when he was 8 days old. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Sarah was 90 years old. She's 10 years younger. And Sarah's joyful reaction to the birth is recorded in verse 6. She says, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. Her earlier laughter of incredulity then is turned into this laughter of joy. Laughter which will be shared by all of those who hear of the birth of Isaac. Sarah and Abraham had defied all expectations. Who would have thought such a thing as this would be possible? In verse 7, she says, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would suckle children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Again, it was God who had made all of this possible. We have references in the New Testament to this in Romans, from Paul in Romans chapter 4, verses 19 to 21. Romans chapter 4, verse 19, speaking of Abraham's hope of his, he would have many descendants. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, because he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb, No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. And then also in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 11 and 12, the writer says, by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. So the faith of Abraham and the faith of Sarah commended there in those New Testament letters as well. We'll move on here then to read in chapter 21 of Genesis, verses 8 to 14. The story continues, and the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the lad and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your descendants be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When Isaac reached the age at which he was weaned, Abraham celebrated by holding this great feast that's mentioned in verse 8. Moving from milk, feeding at his mother's breast, moving on to solid food, was recognized as an important stage in a child's development, and so there's this celebration held. Isaac's age is not given here, but it must have been perhaps around 3 years old. That seemed to be about the age when children were weaned, moving from milk onto solid food. But a problem arose here when Sarah saw Hagar's son Ishmael playing with her son Isaac. And Sarah told Abraham to cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. An earlier problem had arisen when Hagar became pregnant, and then she had looked with contempt upon Sarah. And Sarah had retaliated at that time by treating Hagar harshly, and Hagar had run away. She had returned after the angel of the Lord instructed her to do so. This is back in chapter 16, verses 4 to 9. However, there still seemed to be tensions in the household following the birth of Isaac. The consequences of Abraham's relationship with Hagar and the birth of Ishmael are still being felt here. But why didn't Sarah like Ishmael playing with Isaac? Playing is how the Revised Standard Version translates that, but the Authorized Version and the New International Version say that Ishmael was mocking Isaac, and the English Standard Version that he was laughing at Isaac. So it seems that this is not simply innocent child's play that's going on here, but Ishmael was mocking or making fun of Isaac, ridiculing him in some way, and it was this that now upset Sarah. Ishmael is 14 years older than Isaac, so if Isaac is now about 3 years old, then Ishmael would be about 17 years old, so quite an age difference here. And so with the birth of Isaac, the family dynamics have changed here. As the eldest, Ishmael perhaps would have thought of himself as the heir, at least entitled to a share of the inheritance. But Sarah was concerned that Ishmael should not be heir along with Isaac. She would not tolerate Ishmael being seen as the equivalent or in a position greater than Isaac, and she certainly would not allow her son to be mocked or belittled by Ishmael. She's doing what most mothers would do in protecting their own children. And so Sarah then appeals to Abraham to cast out Hagar and Ishmael. The word that's used there for cast them out is also a word that is used of divorce as well. So basically she's telling Abraham to divorce them, to cut them off, to send them away. So in speaking to Abraham, Sarah does not refer to them by name, but simply as this slave woman with her son, send them away. Again, perhaps an indication of the hostility that she felt towards Hagar and Ishmael. However, the matter was displeasing to Abraham, we're told. He wasn't happy about this. In verse 11, we're told, on account of his son. Ishmael is still Abraham's son, and he loved him, even though with the birth of Isaac, he's no longer going to be the heir. So Abraham was not happy at the thought of casting Ishmael and his mother out. However, God intervened in the matter, and he spoke to Abraham, telling him not to be displeased about this, but to do as Sarah had asked. It was not that God necessarily approved of Sarah's attitude in this, but rather that this would turn out to be the best solution to the problem. And God reassures Abraham that Isaac would be the son through whom Abraham's descendants would be named. He's the son of the promise, whilst also reaffirming that a nation would be established through Ishmael, since he was also Abraham's son. The next morning, then, Abraham provided Hagar and Ishmael with some supplies, with some bread and some water, and sent them away. And so Hagar left, and she wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, which you can see circled on the map just a little bit further to the south of where Abraham had been before. We should notice Paul's use of this incident as an allegory in Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 to 31. Paul takes this story of Hagar and Ishmael and Sarah and Isaac, and he makes an allegory of it in order to illustrate those who are under the law and compare them with those who are free. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 21, he says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave and one by a free woman." So there's the two sons, Ishmael and Isaac there, and the mothers, Hagar and Sarah. "But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, the son of the free woman through promise." Now this is an allegory. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, "Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in travail. For the children of the desolate one are many more than the children of her that is married. Now we, brethren, like Isaac, are children of promise. But as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave and her son, for the son of the slave shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brethren, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman." So an interesting use of the story made there in Galatians to draw that contrast between those under the old covenant, Sinai covenant, and those under the new covenant of Christ and the freedom that we have in Christ. Moving on here in Genesis chapter 21, the last verses of the chapter, well, not of the chapter, where we're going to go to this evening, verse 15 to 21. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down over against him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Let me not look upon the death of the child." And as she sat over against him, the child lifted up his voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water, and gave the lad a drink. And God was with the lad, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So when the provisions that Abraham had given to Hagar and Ishmael were exhausted, Hagar left her son under a bush, and she went off some distance away. We're told about the distance of a bow shot, however far that is that you could shoot an arrow. And she prays that she would not have to watch Ishmael die. So they're in desperate circumstances here. They're out of water, they're out of food, and it seems that Ishmael is close to death. Ishmael was distressed and weeping, and God heard the child weeping, and the angel of God spoke to Hagar, asking, "What troubles you, Hagar?" The angel told her not to be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy. There's a play on words here. The name Ishmael means God hears. And now the angel tells Hagar that God has heard. God has Ishmaeled the cry of the boy. Hagar is also told to go to her son and to hold him fast by her hand, because God has promised to make of him a great nation. So there's a repeat here of the promise that God had made back in chapter 16 verse 10, and repeated again in chapter 17 verse 20, that from Ishmael a great nation would come. So God then opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water. God is able to direct her to that well of water. So she filled the skin with water and gave some to Ishmael to drink. Verses 20 and 21 here shows God's care for Ishmael, and once again God's faithfulness to his promises. God was with Ishmael. He grew up and he lived in the wilderness, and he became an expert with the bow. And we're told that he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and that's the desert region between Canaan and Sinai, down that area to the south. And his mother took a wife for him from Egypt. Remember, Hagar is an Egyptian herself, so she obtains a wife for him from her homeland. That brings us to the end of this part of the story here. We'll finish off the chapter. There's another incident in the chapter 21 here. Abimelech comes back into the story again at the end, but we'll keep that for next week, and into chapter 22 with the sacrifice of Isaac. That's to come next week, but we'll stop here for this evening. And there's a few questions there to think about, perhaps. What problems arose as a consequence of human actions in these stories that we've looked at this evening? See, actions always have consequences. And then how did God's intervention prevent worse things from happening? And what promises did God keep in these stories that we've looked at this evening? So there's a few things to be thinking about on this. So we'll stop there for this evening, and if anyone has any thoughts